Welcome to the debate. You know, when an engineer looks at a suspension bridge, the forces holding it together are entirely invisible. But they're perfectly calculable, right?
Right, like tension, compression, gravity.
Exactly. You can't see these forces with the naked eye, but you trust them because their structural reality is just undeniable. I mean, if you step out onto the steel, it holds your weight.
It does. But, when we look at human relationships, whether we're talking about, say, the mystical idea of a twin flame, or an alliance between two global superpowers, or even a community's bond to its ancestral environment, we borrow that exact same language of invisible, undeniable forces.
We do.
We talk about destiny, we talk about telepathy, fated alignment. But the core question here is, are those forces actually real? Or are we just, inventing fairy tales to hide the terrifying fact that keeping human beings aligned is just exhausting, continuous work?
And that is exactly the tension we are exploring today. We're looking at what we might broadly call the special connection. I'm taking the position that these exceptional alignments are, they're profound structural realities. They are built on shared identity and deep responsiveness, and they essentially serve as the absolute apex of human emotional, political, and cultural coordination. So to go back to the metaphor, the bridge might be invisible, but the physics are real.
Right. And I will be taking the contrasting position. I argue that the special connection is essentially a universal architecture of relational exceptionalism.
Okay.
It's a constructed myth. We use it to mask cognitive dissonance, to hide power imbalances, and frankly, to obscure the inevitable decay of human systems. It is the fairy tale we tell ourselves because we absolutely abhor existential vulnerability.
Well, let's test that theory right at the ground level, starting with our most intimate interpersonal bonds. When people talk about finding the one or having this fated connection, you argue that this is actually a destructive mindset.
Highly destructive. Because when people believe in a fated connection, they often hold what psychologists call destiny beliefs, which sounds very romantic. I mean, Hollywood loves it.
Oh, sure. The rom-com ideal.
Exactly. But research demonstrates that individuals with strong destiny beliefs actually exhibit severe attachment anxiety. They are incredibly unforgiving of their partner's offenses. And if you think about the mechanics of it, it actually makes perfect sense. Because if this connection is truly fated or, handed down by the universe, it should be effortless.
Right. It should be perfect from day one.
Right. So the moment there's friction, the illusion crumbles. When inevitable conflict arises, they catastrophize. They use negative exit strategies like ghosting because their entire mythological framework of effortless compatibility has just been shattered. They don't have the tools to fix the bridge because they thought the bridge was made of magic. The special connection myth makes them incredibly fragile.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you're really conflating genuine responsiveness with toxic limerence.
How so?
Well, what you're describing, this obsessive neurochemical state where you aren't actually seeing the other person, but you're rather just addicted to the fantasy of them, that is a psychological projection. It's not actual interpersonal chemistry.
But people call it chemistry all the time.
They call it that, sure. But the psychologist Harry Rees has this brilliant conceptual model that separates that chemical high from actual chemistry. Projection is when someone wants a relationship to work so badly, they just assume their partner shares their values. But true chemistry, it cannot be faked, and it certainly isn't effortless.
But people mistake that effort for magic constantly.
Only if they don't understand the mechanism. Rees points out that chemistry requires coordinated, goal-relevant activity. It requires a two-way street of support and, self-disclosure. It's a structural build. Just because people misuse the idea of destiny to avoid doing the work doesn't mean deep, measurable interpersonal chemistry doesn't exist.
I don't deny that people coordinate. What I deny is the labeling of this coordination as some exceptional mystical bond. Look at our cultural obsession with twins.
Okay, twins.
Monozygotic twins share identical DNA. So the public automatically assumes they have a single mirrored personality and they share, quote-unquote, twin telepathy. Parents share these videos of twins communicating wordlessly online, and society just slaps an extrasensory label on it.
which behavioral genetics has completely demystified.
Completely. What looks like telepathy is really just synchronous behavior due to identical developmental milestones. Even cryptophagia.
Oh, right, the secret language?
Yeah, that creepy private language twins sometimes develop. It is literally just a natural developmental delay. It's caused by intense, exclusive proximity during the phase of language acquisition. They mispronounce words in the exact same way, they reinforce it with each other, and it sounds like a secret language. It is entirely biological and environmental, not mystical. But we force the special connection narrative onto them anyway because, well, we desperately want to believe in magic.
I have to push back there. Stripping away the mystical label doesn't actually diminish the reality that a highly specialized, exceptional bond has formed. Just because we can explain the mechanism of the connection, like, shared developmental milestones, doesn't mean the connection itself isn't extraordinary.
But it's just biological proximity.
But the proximity creates a structural evolution. Rises points out that chemistry involves verbal, nonverbal, and even neural synchrony. Mirror neurons actually activate in tandem to enable that wordless communication. When you and I are having a deeply engaged conversation, our brainwaves literally begin to sync up. The mouth is real. We don't need to call it magic to acknowledge that it is a truly exceptional state of human connection.
But the label matters. The label is the entire problem, because when we label it mystical or special, we weaponize it. We use the narrative of connection, or frankly, the sudden traumatic lack of it, to justify terrible behavior and mask our own psychological damage.
Wait, give me an example of how we weaponize it.
We see this acutely in the realm of casual sex. Let's look at psychologist Sam Vaknin's analysis, which is just fascinating.
Okay.
So, two people engage in a one-night stand. The next day, they both claim the encounter meant nothing. They brush it off. They say the other person is a nobody. But Vaknin points out that this is a totally fabricated narrative. It is designed to paper over severe cognitive dissonance.
Let's break that down for the listener. What is actually causing that cognitive dissonance on a mechanical level?
It's a physiological rupture of the human sexual script. So biologically, during the act itself, the brain is flooded with oxytocin.
The bonding hormone.
Exactly. That chemical's entire evolutionary purpose is to create bonding and deep attachment. Your body is physically writing a script that says, we are connected. But when the act ends abruptly the next morning with no subsequent commitment and cold detachment, it creates a massive emotional schism. The body says bond, but the reality says abandonment.
So the mind basically has to build a defense mechanism.
Precisely. To cope with this, the individual actively devalues the partner and the situation. It's the classic fox and the grapes fable. I didn't want them anyway. They engage in what Vaknin calls autoerotic empathy.
Autoerotic empathy, wow.
Yeah. Because they cannot safely direct their empathy toward the partner who just abandoned them, they use the partner merely as an imperfect mirror to fall in love with themselves. They self-soothe by regulating their own self-esteem and insisting that they are the one in control. So that whole casual strings-free narrative, it's a complete illusion masking deep physiological distress.
That is a very grim, though I suppose clinically accurate, picture of how we protect ourselves from the absence of a connection. But what happens when the connection is profound but troubled?
We do the exact inverse. We invent the twin flame myth. People use this highly romanticized narrative to justify toxic, enmeshed relationships. If a partnership involves extreme distress, constant separation, emotional despair, those are massive red flags of incompatibility. But if you label it a twin flame, suddenly that abuse is reframed as a special spiritual test. The myth of the exceptional connection essentially keeps them trapped in a cycle of trauma.
Look, it is undeniably true that unconscious attraction often draws us to partners who mirror our unhealed childhood wounds. People are unconsciously driven to recreate their earliest emotional traumas in an attempt to, finally resolve those unmet developmental needs. But I would argue this isn't inherently a terminal flaw of deep connections.
Wait, how is recreating childhood trauma not a terminal flaw?
Because the friction can be generative. Using psychiatrist Judith Orloff's framework, working through those exact emotional triggers is precisely what transforms a cellmate dynamic back into a soulmate dynamic.
Assuming they do the work, which, as we just discussed with destiny beliefs, the myth actively discourages them from doing.
Well, the Disney version of the myth discourages it, yes. But Orloff argues that the true exceptional connection is not about someone saving you or completing you without effort. It's about two people acting as a secure, safe container to navigate those unresolved emotional triggers together. When the honeymoon phase ends, when the oxytocin wears off and the flaws actually emerge, the mutual commitment to growth is what makes the connection exceptional. The friction isn't proof the connection is an illusion. The friction is the mechanism of growth itself. It is active labor.
I mean, I understand the clinical optimism there, I do. But I don't buy that this reflects how human systems actually deploy the concept of the special connection. You're trying to rescue the idea by redefining it as hard work. But human beings aren't the only entities terrified of vulnerability. Nations are too.
Nations? Okay, where are we going with this?
Let's move the lens to macro systems to prove that this exceptionalism is just a universal tool for leverage. Let's look at Winston Churchill and the famous Anglo-American special relationship.
The geopolitical bedrock of the 20th century.
A bedrock made of incredibly effective PR. I mean, history shows us that this special relationship was a deliberate, calculated diplomatic stratagem. Churchill essentially invented the phrase in his 1946 Fulton speech, the same speech where he coined the Iron Curtain, by the way. He was applying the exact same psychological defense mechanism we see in individuals, but on a geopolitical scale.
To mask Britain's vulnerability.
Exactly. Following World War II, the United Kingdom was in severe geopolitical decline. The empire was completely bankrupt. Churchill needed to lock the emerging American superpower into defending British interests. And historians like David Reynolds have mapped exactly how this was a constructed myth, an invented tradition of this fraternal English-speaking bond.
Right.
It masked the reality that the relationship was highly competitive, fraught with friction over the remnants of the British Empire, and becoming intensely asymmetrical. America was calling the shots, but the myth allowed Britain to save face.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently, because you're looking at the shadow and ignoring the object casting it. Just because a connection is formalized to serve a strategic diplomatic purpose doesn't mean the underlying shared history is fabricated.
But the specialness was fabricated for leverage.
Leverage requires a fulcrum. Churchill may have coined the term to manipulate American public opinion, sure, but the Anglo-American alliance produced the most complete unification of military effort in history. Up to that point, it birthed the Atlantic Charter, which was literally the blueprint for the world's post-war goals. It birthed the Bretton Woods system, which established the rules for commercial and financial relations among the world's major industrial states.
Right, but
You cannot build the entire post-war global economic order on a pure illusion. There had to be an actual structural bedrock of cultural, linguistic, and operational alignment to build upon.
A bedrock of mutual self-interest, certainly, but framing it as a special relationship created an illusion of permanent, fated alignment that caused immense strategic blindness. I mean, British policymakers started believing their own myth, which left them constantly shocked when the U.S. acted in its own sovereign interest.
Like during the Suez Crisis?
Exactly. Most notably during the Suez Crisis, when Eisenhower basically threatened to crash the British pound if they didn't withdraw from Egypt. The myth of the special connection left the UK totally exposed.
A miscalculation of the bond's limits doesn't mean the bond didn't exist.
Well, let me give you another example of macro myth-making, this time in international human rights law. I want to look at the distinctive connection doctrine regarding indigenous peoples.
Oh, this is actually one of the strongest proofs of my position, but go ahead and lay out your critique first.
Okay, so in international law, indigenous peoples are granted collective property rights over their ancestral lands based on what the courts call a distinct cultural and spiritual connection to that environment. I argue this is primarily a legal construct. Because indigenous communities were historically stripped of traditional sovereign prerogative through colonization, the international legal framework had to invent a new doctrinal category to secure their property rights against state encroachment.
It is a functional workaround.
Yes, to manage a severe power asymmetry. It's a way for tribunals to give them standing in court when they don't have traditional title deeds.
Let's pause on that mechanism for a second, because I think it proves the exact opposite of what you're claiming. The legal doctrine didn't invent the connection. The legal doctrine was forced to evolve to recognize a profound, lived reality that predated the law itself by thousands of years. Think about why tribunals struggle with this. A standard legal tribunal is designed to measure material loss, like how many dollars was that acre of timber worth.
Right, it's standard property law.
But how do you quantify a disrupted spiritual lifeway? If we look at the foundational work by UN Special Rapporteurs like Martinez Cobo and James Anaya, an indigenous community's connection to the land is defined by historical continuity, specific cultural patterns, and a deeply rooted ecological symbiosis. When a mining operation destroys a sacred river, they aren't just losing water, they're losing their cosmology. The distinctive connection is an anthropological fact. The legal construct is merely attempting, however imperfectly, to map a rigid legal measuring stick onto an exceptional relationship that existing property laws just couldn't process.
But look at the track that creates. Doesn't this just lock indigenous peoples in an essentialist narrative?
Define what you mean by essentialist in this context.
It means it demands they remain a perfectly preserved museum exhibit of spirituality to keep their land rights. If their rights are legally contingent on maintaining this pristine, deeply spiritual connection to nature, what happens when a community wants to modernize? What if they want to build a casino or commercially log their own forest to build economic leverage? The myth of the pure, special connection becomes a cage. It's the same pattern. We romanticize the bond to bypass the complex, often transactional realities of how communities actually interact with their environments.
That is a very real risk in how courts apply the law, yes. But acknowledging a distinctive connection doesn't inherently trap a community in the past. Ideally, it provides them with the autonomy to dictate their own future. It grants them the legal standing to say, our relationship with this territory is existential. That isn't a myth. That is the absolute apex of human cultural coordination with an environment.
The problem is that whenever we demand these relationships carry the weight of an entire cosmology, or in the case of a marriage, an entire psychological universe, we just guarantee their collapse. Which brings me to the sheer unsustainability of modern myth-making. Let's look at what sociologist Eli Finkel calls Mount Maslow.
The psychological suffocation of modern marriage.
Precisely, we have taken the myth of this special connection to its most absurd, punishing extreme. Historically, marriage was an institution wired to handle basic survival. It was an economic partnership for food, shelter, reproduction, social stability. But today, we expect a single partner to meet us on 25 different levels of intersection.
It's true.
We expect them to be our best friend, our equal co-parent, our financial partner, our passionate lover, our therapist, and our spiritual guide. We expect them to help us reach self-actualization at the very top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
The load is massive.
It's like plugging a massive modern entertainment center into a 1920s electrical socket. The system shorts out because the wiring simply isn't built for that much voltage. We have built a wobbling, giant stack of expectation. It suffocates the relationship under its own weight because no single human being can fulfill that mythic role. It's a setup for inevitable disappointment.
Finkel's research absolutely highlights the danger of that weight, but he also points to the mechanical solution, defrieding. This means consciously outsourcing some of those needs to a diverse network of close friends, family, and community. You take the pressure off the central socket, which preserves the core bundle of needs for the primary partner.
But by defrieding, you are structurally conceding my entire point.
How so?
You are acknowledging that the mythological expectation of the one true special connection fails. You have to rely on a distributed network of emotional support just to keep the primary relationship from imploding.
The special connection only survives if you dilute it with reality.
Diluting it with reality is what makes it a structural fact, rather than a fairy tale. You've argued throughout this debate that because humans have to work at these connections, because we have to process cognitive dissonance after casual sex, because we have to negotiate diplomatic leverage, and because we have to defrate our marital expectations, that the connections themselves are illusions. But I firmly believe that this labor is the very evidence of their reality.
Labor proves effort. It doesn't prove destiny.
But the effort produces a singular architecture. From the deep interpersonal chemistry that shapes our private lives to the cultural and historical bonds that define entire peoples and alliances. These connections demand rigorous, continuous effort. And yes, our expectations of them are sometimes dangerously idealized. But they are not illusions. When two entities commit to that level of mutual responsiveness, it represents the highest achievement of human trust.
It really just comes down to whether we have the courage to look at our relationships without the rose-tinted glasses. We romanticize destiny, telepathy, fated geopolitical alliances, because the alternative, that every bond is just an endless series of vulnerable choices and unromantic labor, is exhausting.
Yeah, it is.
But by clinging to the myth, we set ourselves up for strategic shock. Whether it's an individual staying in an abusive twin flame dynamic, or a nation operating under the illusion of an unbreakable alliance, or a person ghosting a good partner because it wasn't perfectly frictionless, the myth does damage. The invisible forces you rely on only exist as long as we actively choose to generate them. If you stop maintaining the steel, gravity will prove just how fragile your forces really are.
Exhausting, yes, but also beautiful. Because if the bridge holds, it's not because of magic. It's because we built it to withstand the wind. The tension between the ideal we strive for and the reality we must manage is something we all have to navigate, from our living rooms to international tribunals.
There is incredibly rich detail in the source material we drew from today, and I highly suggest our listeners explore the research of Harry Rice, Eli Finkel, C.M. Vaknin, and the international legal frameworks we debated.
Absolutely. But as always, we'll leave the final verdict to you. Is the bridge held together by the fundamental math of the universe or just the stubborn defensive will of the engineers? Think on that the next time you feel an undeniable spark.